too much noise today. I just need the road, the rain, and the hum of the engine.
Have you ever felt like there's a part of you don't really understand? Like, you're not sure who you really are anymore? I've been there too. Let me share something with you. Maybe it'll help you see things a little clearer. I hear people say life begins when you're young, when you're bursting with energy, filled with dreams, chasing things like love, career, status, or approval. And for the longest time, I believed that too. I thought the point was to race forward, build something, become someone. But if I'm being honest, back then, I wasn't really living. I was performing, mimicking what I thought success looked like, what love should feel like, what happiness was supposed to be. It was like I was reading a script I hadn't written, playing a part someone else had cast me in. You know, no one tells you how heavy that gets, the weight of being someone you're not. At first, it's easy to wear the mask. It even feels empowering. People praise you, opportunities show up, you start ticking boxes. But somewhere along the line, it stops feeling like armor and starts feeling like a cage. That's what happened to me. I remember being in my late 30s, standing in front of the mirror one evening, and not recognizing the person looking back. Sure, the face was mine, older than I remembered, tired in a way I couldn't quite explain, but it was the eyes. They looked hollow, not empty like sadness, but more like absence. Like something essential had gone missing over the years. I had everything I thought I wanted, the job, the respect, and nice place to live. But something inside whispered, "Is this all there is?" It wasn't a scream, just a subtle echo that kept returning in quiet moments, like when the TV was off or during late drives home in silence. It grew louder when I was alone, when the distractions faded. That whisper started asking questions I didn't have the courage to answer. What am I doing? Why does this feel so shallow? Who am I even doing this for? It's funny. I used to think those questions meant something was wrong with me, like I was ungrateful or broken. Everyone else seemed fine, chasing the same things. But now I see it differently. Those questions weren't symptoms of failure. They were signs of awakening, signals that my soul was tired of pretending, that some deeper part of me wanted to be seen, wanted to breathe. I think the first real crack in my illusion came when I realized how much of my life had been shaped by what other people expected. How many of my choices were based not on what I truly wanted, but on what would make me look good or be approved of or not be abandoned. That realization hit like a wave. It knocked the wind out of me, but with it came something unexpected, relief, a quiet kind of liberation. Because if I had built this life to please others, then maybe, just maybe, I could build a different one that felt true. That thought scared me, but also gave me hope. And hope, however fragile, has a way of lighting even the darkest corners of our inner world. I didn't change overnight. Honestly, I didn't even know how to begin. But I started paying attention to what drained me, to what lit me up, to when I felt small and when I felt whole. And slowly, very slowly, I began peeling away the layers I'd wrapped myself in. It hurt. There were days when I felt lost, stripped bare of all the roles I used to hide behind. But there was also something strangely beautiful in that rawness, like meeting myself for the first time. Looking back, I think we all go through this in some form. That moment when life as we knew it stops making sense, and we're left standing at a crossroads, unsure of what's next. Some call it a midlife crisis. I prefer to call it an invitation. An invitation to stop pretending, to begin again, to live, not by default, but by design. And if you're standing at that place now, wondering why everything feels so unsteady, why your old dreams feel too small, why your soul aches for something more, you're not broken. You're waking up, and that's the real beginning. The hardest part, honestly, was admitting that I didn't really know who I was. I mean, sure, I could list my job title, my accomplishments, the roles I played, friend, partner, achiever. But those weren't me. They were pieces of an identity I had carefully assembled over the years, mostly to be accepted, admired, or at least not rejected. Somewhere in the chase for being someone, I had lost touch with myself. What's strange is that everyone applauds you for building that mask. Society rewards it. You become reliable, successful, well put together. No one ever pulls you aside to ask, but does it feel real? It's as if we're all in on this silent agreement to keep up appearances, to smile even when we're aching, to nod even when we disagree, to keep going even when we're running on empty. But at some point, the cracks show. For me, it wasn't dramatic, no breakdown, no explosive moment. It was more like erosion, a slow, persistent sense that I was drifting farther and farther from something essential. I found myself feeling numb in moments that should have been joyful, disconnected in conversations that once felt alive. I was there physically, functionally, but emotionally, spiritually, I was somewhere else. Nowhere. That's when I started reading more deeply. Jung came into my life like a mirror I wasn't ready for. His word about the persona, the social mask we all wear, hit me hard. Because it wasn't just theory. It was my life. I had spent decades refining that mask, unaware that underneath it, my true self had grown quiet, almost invisible. Jung said that the persona is necessary. We need it to function in society, to relate to others. But the danger comes when we forget it's a mask, when we begin to believe the mask is us. And I had done just that. I had forgotten what my face looked like without it. So I began asking difficult questions. When did I start hiding parts of myself? What parts had I buried because they were inconvenient, too emotional, too vulnerable? Where did I learn that being acceptable was more important than being whole? The answers didn't come all at once, but memories surfaced, moments in childhood where I felt I had to be the good one, the strong one. Times I swallowed my pain to keep the peace. Times I laughed when I wanted to cry. Times I chose silence over truth because truth might have made someone uncomfortable. Those moments weren't isolated. They were the blueprint of my mask. I started journaling. Not the polished kind of writing, but the raw, messy kind. I let my fear spill out. My guilt, my anger, my sadness. I wrote things I'd never said aloud. Things I didn't even know I believed until they showed up on the page. And you know what? I didn't judge them. I let them live. I gave those hidden parts of me a voice. Something powerful happens when you do that. You begin to see that the parts you thought were unlovable, the messy, irrational, deeply emotional parts, are actually the ones closest to your essence. They're not flaws. They're fragments of your truth, long denied, finally rising to the surface. Of course, this wasn't easy. There were days I wanted to go back to the comfort of autopilot. Days when I missed the certainty of my old roles. But I knew I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. I couldn't unknow the truth that my mask, as polished as it was, had become a prison. So I kept going. I stopped saying yes when I meant no. I stopped over-explaining myself to people who weren't really listening. I let some relationships fade, not out of bitterness, but out of honesty. And I began making space for the people and experiences that met me without the mask. This wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about remembering who I was before the world told me who to be. And let me tell you, there's nothing more terrifying or more beautiful. You know what's strange? The deeper I went into this journey, the more I peeled away the layers, the masks, the expectations, the louder the silence became. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of something vast, still, and completely honest. And in that silence, one question echoed again and again. Is this all there is? At first, it felt like a question born of despair, like some void opening up beneath me. But over time, I realized it wasn't a cry of hopelessness. It was a doorway, a subtle nudge from something wiser inside me, gently pointing out that I'd reached the edge of the map I had been following. And now, if I wanted more meaning, more presence, more truth, I had to step into the unknown. This was the beginning of something Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are. Not who the world expects you to be, not even who you once thought you had to be, but who you are at the core, beneath the noise, the roles, the survival strategies. But individuation isn't some spiritual Instagram slogan. It's raw. It's uncomfortable. It starts with disillusionment, the dream job that no longer excites you, The relationship that feels like a performance. The habits that once gave you comfort, now feeling suffocating. All of it begins to unravel. And here's the kicker. People around you might not understand. When you start to change, even quietly, it unsettles the system you've been part of. Friends, family, colleagues, they might ask, "What's wrong?" when really something finally feels right. But they can't see that yet. They only see the withdrawal, the hesitation, the shift. And sometimes that can be lonely. I felt that loneliness deeply, like I was stepping out of an old life barefoot, with nothing but questions and the faint outline of something better. I couldn't articulate it. I just knew the old ways weren't working anymore, and I couldn't pretend they were. This is where I began meeting the shadow. Jung talked about the shadow as all the parts of ourselves we deny, the anger we suppress, the desires we judge, the pain we know. I used to think I didn't have a shadow. I thought I was nice. But the truth? I had just become very skilled at hiding what I was ashamed of. Anger? I swallowed it and called it patience. Grief? I turned it into busyness. Envy? I masked it with fake cheer. All of it got stuffed into the basement of my psyche, out of sight, out of mind, until it didn't stay hidden anymore. It came out in exhaustion, in sudden irritation, in emotional numbness. The shadow doesn't vanish, it waits. And when it's finally ready to be acknowledged, it doesn't whisper. It roars. The first time I really sat with my shadow, I cried. Not just from sadness, but from relief. Finally, I wasn't fighting myself anymore. I wasn't pretending. I looked at the parts one had long rejected, the insecure one, the jealous one, the hurt child. And instead of shaming them, I listened. That's when I realized something profound. Wholeness isn't about being perfect. It's about being real. It's not about removing the darkness. It's about learning to hold it with compassion. This shift in perspective changed everything. I stopped chasing clarity and started honoring mystery. I stopped asking what's wrong with me and started asking, what am I not listening to? I stopped trying to fix myself and began trying to understand myself. And in that space, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being okay, but the kind that comes from finally being okay with not having all the answers. That question, is this all there is? It still visits me sometimes. But now I welcome it, because I know it's not an end. It's an invitation, a gentle reminder that life doesn't just happen to us. We can meet it, shape it, participate in it. And that, I think, is the beginning of real freedom. If you had asked me a few years ago what freedom meant, I probably would have said something like, being able to do what I want when I want. Maybe you'd have said something similar. That's how we're taught to think about it, right? Freedom is choice, as movement, as independence. But what no one told me, what I had to learn the hard way, is that real freedom isn't external. It's not about more options. It's about fewer illusions. It's about finally telling the truth to yourself, even when it shakes the foundation of everything you thought you believed. The truth I came face to face with. I'd spent most of my life living a script I didn't write. And the scariest part? I had volunteered for it. You know what I mean, right? We learn so early to shape ourselves for others, for approval, for love, for survival. It's subtle. It starts with wanting to be the good kid, or the smart one, or the strong one. It grows into people-pleasing, perfectionism, overachieving. All defense mechanisms dressed up as virtues. By the time we hit our 30s or 40s, we're often so far from ourselves that we don't even notice the quiet ache anymore. We call it stress, fatigue, burnout, but it's deeper. It's the soul whispering, come back. I resisted that call for a long time. I kept chasing distractions, changed jobs, tried new routines, bought things I didn't need, numbed with screens and plans and goals. But the ache, it stayed. Until one day, I just couldn't run anymore. I was too tired, not physically, but spiritually. So I stopped. And when I did, I heard something underneath the noise. You don't have to prove anything anymore. That moment broke me open. I realized how much of my life had been fueled by fear. The fear of not being enough, not being lovable, not being seen. I had been hustling for my worth, believing that if I just worked harder, gave more, fixed myself better, then I'd finally earn rest. Peace, belonging. But peace doesn't wait at the end of performance. It begins when we stop performing. That's when I started reimagining what my life could be. Not from a place of striving, but from stillness. I began asking different questions. What actually matters to me? What feels true when no one is watching? What I want to let go of? Not because it's bad, but because it's no longer mine to carry. These weren't easy questions. They unraveled me. I had to face the fact that some of my relationships were built on roles I no longer wanted to play. That some of my goals were never really mine. That the version of me I'd spent years perfecting wasn't who I wanted to grow old as. Letting go was painful. It meant saying goodbye to certain identities. It meant disappointing people who loved the old version of me. But it also meant coming home to myself. I started giving myself permission. Permission to rest. To not explain. To take up space. To want less, but feel more. I stopped chasing happiness and started cultivating meaning. And meaning, I learned, doesn't come from grand moments. It comes from presence, from truth, from living in alignment, even when it's quiet, even when it's hard. Viktor Frankl wrote, "When a person can't find a deep sense of meaning, they distract themselves with pleasure." I had done that for years, but now I was done distracting. I wasn't interested in escaping anymore. I wanted to engage, fully, gently, honestly, and that, for me, is the essence of real freedom. Not the ability to escape your life, but the courage to fully inhabit it. Shadow and all, mess and all, without apology. Because what if the life you've been searching for isn't somewhere out there, but waiting for you inside the one you already have, once you start living it as you? Something started to shift in me once I stopped trying to figure it all out and instead allowed myself to feel what was real. Not just the polished feelings like gratitude or hope, but the uncomfortable ones too. The restlessness, the grief, the rage I had tucked away for years because I thought feeling it would make me less lovable. But it didn't make me less. It made me more. There's a quiet dignity in choosing to face yourself without flinching. No masks, no filters, just raw, unedited truth. And that's where my priorities began to rearrange themselves. Not through willpower or some big revelation, but through soft clarity that came from being honest with myself. I realized I no longer wanted to live a life that looked good but felt hollow. I was done pretending ambition was enough. Done chasing approval in rooms where I couldn't even breathe. Done explaining parts of myself to people who only wanted fragments. What I craved was depth, not in an abstract way, but in the way you crave water when you've been walking through a desert of superficiality. I wanted conversations that nourished me, days that felt aligned, moments that left residue on my soul, not just on my calendar. That's when I began choosing being over doing. I slowed down. I started waking up early just to sit in silence, not to check off a box, but to listen. I found myself spending more time in nature, noticing how the trees didn't rush to bloom, how the sky didn't apologize for shifting moods. There was a kind of wisdom in that, a quiet reminder that existence itself is enough. I started asking myself before every decision, is this in harmony with who I am now? Not who I was 5 years ago, or who someone else wants me to be, but the version of me that had emerged through the unraveling, the version that finally had a voice. It didn't mean I dropped everything and moved to the mountains. It meant I got intentional. I gave up multitasking for presence. I replaced endless striving with slower, more soulful pursuits. I stopped forcing connections and started nurturing the ones that felt mutual, effortless, real. I also let go of the need to constantly be improving. That was a big one. For years, I had internalized this belief that growth meant always fixing, optimizing, upgrading. But real growth, I've found, often feels more like unlearning, releasing, coming closer to the person you've always been before the world told you otherwise. And you know what else? I started to enjoy my own company, not in a cliche, self-love kind of way, but in a deeper, more grounded way. I stopped filling every moment with noise and started sitting with myself, not as a project to fix, but as a presence to respect. That's when I noticed a tenderness I hadn't felt in years, a soft voice inside that said, "You're doing okay. You don't have to rush anymore." Science even backs this up, you know? As we get older, our brains shift. The emotional centers regulate more efficiently. We're less reactive, more reflective. We're better at choosing what really matters and letting go of the rest. It's like the wiring of our souls finally starts to match the longings of our hearts. That's why I've stopped treating midlife as a decline and started honoring it as a return. A sacred homecoming to myself. Not the self that chases, but the self that knows. Knows what peace feels like, what truth tastes like, what love means when it's not wrapped in performance. This isn't to say life becomes easy. The world still throws curveballs. Old wounds still flare up. But something in me is different now. I don't meet those moments with the same panic or self-blame. I meet them with presence, with softness, with the quiet power of someone who's no longer trying to earn their place in the world, because I've already claimed it. And in that, I found a kind of joy that ambition never gave me. Not the ecstatic, high-energy kind, but the grounded, soul-deep kind that comes from living aligned with what matters. It's not a life that always looks impressive, but it's a life that feels true. Somewhere along the way, I stopped fearing the word crisis. You know how it gets tossed around like a warning sign? Midlife crisis, as if hitting your 40s or 50s means you've failed some unspoken test of adulthood. Like you missed the mark, and now the rest is just damage control. But I don't see it that way anymore. Not after everything. What I once saw as a breakdown, I now recognize as a breakthrough. The moment the outer scaffolding collapses so the inner structure can finally rise. I remember the first time I heard someone say, "This isn't falling apart, it's falling together." It sounded poetic, maybe even a little naive, but now it feels like truth. There's something profoundly honest about realizing you no longer want to live someone else's definition of success. That you're finally willing to lose what's false in order to make room for what's real. And yes, that can feel like chaos at first, like free-falling, like mourning a version of yourself you spent years building. But in that grief, there's also clarity. Because when the noise fades, when you stop trying to hold it all together, you begin to hear the voice that's been whispering underneath all along. That voice started asking me questions I couldn't ignore. What do you really value? What are you ready to leave behind? Who are you without the titles, the roles, the expectations? And maybe the hardest one, what kind of life do you want to create? Now that you know none of this is guaranteed, I didn't have neat answers. I still don't. But what changed is that I started living with the questions instead of against them. I stopped waiting for certainty and began trusting my inner compass, even when it led me down unfamiliar paths. Some paths meant saying no to things that used to define me. Some meant walking away from people who only knew how to love the masked version of me. Some meant embracing solitude, not as loneliness, but as sacred space. And some just meant finally doing the thing I'd been too afraid to try, simply because it mattered to me. There's a beautiful defiance in choosing a life that makes sense to your soul, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else. I started writing again, not for work or validation, but for the pure joy of hearing my own thoughts take shape. I picked up old hobbies I had abandoned. I reconnected with people who made me feel seen. And I began dreaming differently, not about climbing ladders, but about cultivating roots. You see, I no longer needed to be impressive. I just wanted to be authentic. I didn't need applause. I needed alignment. And slowly, life began to respond. Not with fireworks, but with small, meaningful moments, deeper conversations, unexpected synchronicities, moments of peace that felt like home. The more I lived from the inside out, the more life began to feel like mine. That's what individuation looks like. Not a destination, but a way of being, not a final answer, but an ongoing conversation with your own soul. It's a willingness to be radically honest, to hold contradictions, to honor your light without denying your shadow. And yes, it takes courage, because the world still wants you to be predictable, agreeable, easy to label. But I think our greatest rebellion is to be fully, unapologetically ourselves, even if it makes people uncomfortable, especially if it makes us finally feel alive. So if you find yourself in that place, that space between what was and what will be, know this. you're not lost. You're being reshaped, and what may look like crisis on the surface could be your soul choosing to evolve. There's something sacred about reaching that moment where you finally stop running. Not because you've arrived at some perfect destination, but because you've realized there was never anywhere to run to, only somewhere to return to. Yourself. That's where I've landed now. Not at the end of the road, but in a clearing. A space where I can breathe deeper, walk slower, and be fully present with who I am, not who I was trying to be. And it's here in this space that I finally understand what people mean when they say life begins at 40. It's not because everything suddenly becomes easy or clear. In fact, many things remain messy and uncertain. But something shifts inside. You stop outsourcing your worth. You stop begging the world to validate your existence. You begin to own your story. The beautiful parts, the broken ones, the ones still being rewritten. The questions change too. They become more real. Less about survival, more about meaning. Less about proving yourself, more about honoring what truly matters. What brings me peace? What relationships nourish me? What parts of my life feel alive? And which ones feel like ghosts I'm still feeding? These aren't theoretical questions anymore. They're practical. They're embodied. They show up in how I spend my mornings. In the way I say no without guilt. In the friends I choose to call. In the silence I no longer fear. And through it all, something has become very clear. Self-acceptance isn't a feeling. It's a practice, a muscle, something you choose again and again, especially on the days when the old scripts try to pull you back, especially when your shadow rises, especially when you forget your own light. I've learned to speak to myself with more gentleness, not because I'm always doing great, but because I no longer believe harshness is the price of growth. I don't need to be hard on myself to evolve. I need to be honest and kind and fiercely loyal to the truth inside me, even when it's uncomfortable. There's a quiet power in that, a grounded strength that doesn't need to shout or convince. It just is, and it's that kind of strength that's guiding me now. I'm no longer interested in pretending I've figured it all out. I haven't, but I'm not pretending to be someone else anymore either, and that feels like freedom. I think about the people I admire most, not because they're successful or brilliant, but because they're real. You can feel their wholeness when they speak. You can sense the depth they've earned through struggle, through surrender, through staying close to their truth. That's what I want to be. Not perfect, not polished, but real. The kind of person who can look at their past with compassion, sit with their present with presence, and walk into their future with integrity. And if that means I live a quieter life, so be it. If that means fewer people understand me, that's okay. I'm not here to be understood by everyone. I'm here to be true to myself. That's what this whole journey has been about. Peeling back the noise, the shoulds, the projections, and reclaiming what was mine all along. My essence, my voice, my way. And so now, when people talk about aging with dread, I smile. Not because I don't understand their fear, I do, but because I've tasted the richness that comes with choosing yourself again and again after years of forgetting how. This is what it means, I think, to begin, not at 20, not at 30, but right here. In the moment you stop living on autopilot. In the moment you decide to live with soul. And if you're standing at the edge of that decision, uncertain but yearning, let me tell you, you're not too late. You're right on time. If this felt meaningful to you, it might mean something to someone else too. So hit like, leave a comment, or subscribe. That's how YouTube knows to share with others. Maybe together, we can help someone see things a little differently.